Welcome back to lecture number 81. This is historical topic 7.13, World War II, the military. The theme is America and the world. This lecture covers the United States' role in the fighting in both Europe and Japan. However, it assumes that you already know what World War II was and how it started. The most agreed upon start date for war is 1939, when Hitler's Germany invaded Poland and consumed most of Europe to defend Nazi expansion. Japan allied with Hitler and was in the middle of their own expansion campaign in East Asia and the Pacific. The U.S. enters the conflict after Japan attacks a naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7, 1941. The learning objective is to explain the causes and effects of the victory of the U.S. and its allies over the Axis powers. The first learning objective is split up in two parts. The first says, Americans viewed the war as a fight for the survival of freedom and democracy against fascist and militarist ideologies. That is to say that Americans viewed the war in purely moral terms. They saw the United States and their allies as good and their enemies as evil. This was promoted through the use of propaganda. The Office of War Information was the mouthpiece to build support for the war. They established the Voice of America, or VOA, broadcast network to report news and other pro-American media. The Office of War Information, or OWI, made films with studios in Hollywood to promote the war's goals, and most movie studios allowed the OWI to nix any scripts that they found as subversive. They created posters like the ones on the slide to build support for the war, sometimes playing on racial stereotypes. By framing all Japanese people in these terms, there was weaker opposition to the internment of Japanese Americans through Executive Order 9066. The OWI even made films documenting the internment and framed it as a humane action. One thing that complicated the OWI's goals of framing the war in moral terms was the U.S. alliance with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was an authoritarian communist state, but also an ally in the war against fascism. The U.S. allied itself with an authoritarian power in order to fight another authoritarian power. The posters down on the bottom left tries to justify the alliance by pointing out a common goal between the two countries. The second part of the key concept says, this perspective that the U.S. was fighting for the survival of freedom and democracy was later reinforced by revelations about Japanese wartime atrocities, Nazi concentration camps, and the Holocaust. The Bataan Death March is the biggest war atrocity committed by Japan against American troops. This happened in the Philippines shortly after Japanese forces expelled the United States in their quest to expand their Pacific Empire. The U.S. military under Douglas MacArthur had to leave quickly and set up their operations in Australia. They leave about 60,000 American service members stranded as the Japanese take the archipelago. They're taken as prisoners of war along with other Filipino soldiers, and they're forced to march around 70 miles over 5 to 10 days with very little food and water, and produced about 15,000 casualties. POWs that faltered or slowed on the march were shot or bayoneted. When the prisoners finally reached the camp, they continued to die in high numbers due to starvation and disease. When news reached the United States, people were outraged. Nazi Germany carried out the Holocaust across Europe. Holocaust is now a word that we use to describe the genocide of Jews in Europe, and it has grown to be synonymous with the genocide in general, though the original meaning of the word is burnt offering. As German troops effectively used blitzkrieg to conquer new territory, they would impose discriminatory laws against Jews and eventually send them to concentration camps. There is a grievous connection to be made here that relates to U.S. history. When the Nazi regime looked to implement the Nuremberg Laws, the set of codes that made German Jews second-class citizens, they sent observers to the U.S. to study how Jim Crow laws had effectively been used across various states to keep black Americans in a second-class position. Nazi Germany went one step further and executed Jews in gas chambers upon arrival of the camps, or worked them in life-threatening conditions. The images from the Holocaust can be quite jarring because of the scale of the killings and its systematic implementation. The picture on the bottom right is a collection of all the eyeglasses of people that arrived in one concentration camp and were eventually killed. In total, across the entirety of the war, about 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. The next key concept says military service provided opportunities for women and minorities to improve their social economic positions for the war's duration, while also leading to debates over racial segregation. The first part of this key concept is more deeply covered in the previous lecture to this, so here we'll focus more closely on the debates over racial segregation. The armed forces during World War II were still segregated. That means that black and white troops fought in separate regiments. One of the lasting effects of this is that the Medal of Honor recommendations for African American soldiers go ignored through the entirety of the war and immediately after. It's not until 1993 that a commission recognized that there was systemic racism in the recognition of American soldiers. In 1997, 7 African American soldiers received the Medal of Honor for their service to World War II, and were finally recognized for their actions. Unfortunately, 6 of the 7 had already died, and only 1 was able to receive their medal in person. In 1948, Executive Order 9981, issued by President Truman, desegregated the armed forces. This was a step in the right direction, proving that the Double V campaign had been somewhat effective. It was hard for America to justify the war in a moral sense, placing democracy against fascism, when people at home were being denied some of the basic rights of living in a democracy. A notable division during the World War, made up of black service members, were the Tuskegee Airmen. They were educated at the Tuskegee Institute, the same one that Booker T. Washington was a director for several decades earlier, and there were about 992 pilots in total, and many of them were recognized positively with military awards. Of these include a Silver Star, Flying Crosses, Bronze Stars, Air Medals, and Purple Hearts. Their missions varied in escorting supplies across the Atlantic or helping in bombing campaigns. Their flight skills was one major reason for the accolades they received. When the Air Force became its own branch of the military, they held their first Top Gun competition in 1949, and the duo that won the top prize were Tuskegee Airmen. The last key concept is split up into three parts, and the first one says the United States and its allies achieved military victory through allied cooperation, technological and scientific advances, the contributions of servicemen and women. One of the technologies that's developed that helps the Americans fight the Germans is the development of radar. It helps to detect the U-boats or submarines. Radar sends out electromagnetic waves similar to wireless networks or cell phones of today. The waves are sent out in consistent bursts, and the radar can detect when there is a disruption of the waves if they are reflected back. It pins these disruptions on the approximate location on a screen. Ships and the escorting pilots then know where to find the submarines and preemptively bomb or torpedo them to have a clear path to their destination. This was instrumental in the Battle of the Atlantic. Controlling access through Atlantic shipping lanes allowed the U.S. to get supplies that was necessary to fight the war in Europe. Frequency hopping was another invention that prevented radio signals from being jammed. It could also be used to guide torpedoes underwater without being detected. The unique thing about these two inventions was that they were devised by an Austrian-American movie star during Hollywood's golden age of film, Hedy Lamarr. Her work in frequency hopping will be the basis for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth technology in the future. The Manhattan Project is probably the most important technological development during the war. It was led by scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer and led the development of the atomic bomb. The first successful test of an atomic bomb was on July 16, 1945, near Alamogordo, New Mexico. His entire project was based out of Los Alamos, New Mexico, in the desert since it's highly secretive. Even Harry Truman, as the newly elected vice president in 1944, was not told about the project until he became president after FDR died. The project utilized the incredible amount of energy that holds an atom together. Through the process of nuclear fission, an atom is split and the energy is released. Upon seeing the first successful detonation of an atomic weapon, Oppenheimer recalled a quote from the Indian epic, the Bhagavad Gita, in which the Hindu deity Krishna reveals himself in all of his power, leaving his human form. He says, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." Less than a month after the first successful test, 2 bombs were dropped on Japanese cities to bring an end to the war. The key concept goes on, saying that victory was achieved through campaigns such as Pacific island hopping and the D-Day invasion. The island hopping campaign in the Pacific Ocean attempted to wrest control back from Japan, and its strategy can be summarized best the way that Douglas MacArthur summarized it. He said to hit 'em where they ain't and let them die on the vine. The United States was going to go across the Pacific and take over islands that were not heavily fortified, or had been left by the Japanese. Using these new holdings, they'd cut off access for the Japanese to resupply the islands that were in the periphery or the furthest parts of the Pacific Empire. As those islands that had been fortified were short on supplies, they became weaker, and the United States was able to take them over with fewer casualties. They'll continue to do this as they get closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. The island hopping campaign could not have been implemented without a victory in the Battle of Midway in early June 1942. It turned the tide in favor of the Allies in the Pacific and also redefined naval warfare. It was a naval battle, but it was mostly fought with planes. Planes would leave aircraft carriers and do bombing raids on the opponent's ships and carriers. As the island hopping campaign reaches its later stages, the islands that are left are much more fortified, and it takes an incredible amount of casualties to gain control of them. This is the case for the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Douglas MacArthur, who had been forced to leave the Philippines earlier in the war, had vowed to return, and return he does. He makes a dramatic show of it by stepping off the amphibious vehicle and into the water to reach the beach. In Europe, D-Day opened up a Western front against Germany. Most of the fighting had been done across other theaters of war. When Hitler invaded France, it did so in such a quick and overwhelming way that French troops evacuated to England. Therefore, there weren't any major battles in France until D-Day. One of the first theaters of war was Northern Africa. Once the German general Rommel was defeated, the U.S. focused its attention on southern Italy. Finally, by 1944, a western front was opened up with the D-Day invasion. It was the largest amphibious attack in history. Almost 200,000 service members from 8 Allied countries coordinated an attack on the Normandy region of northern France. The region was heavily fortified by Nazi artillery, and the beaches were filled with obstacles to keep vehicles from advancing. There were 5 primary landing locations in order from west to east. There was Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold Beach, Juno Beach, and Sword Beach. U.S. troops were responsible for taking Omaha and Utah Beach. Hours before landing started, Allied planes started a bombing campaign to weaken resistance to the landings. Additionally, over 20,000 paratrooper units were dropped behind enemy lines to squeeze the German fortifications from both directions. The invasion was successful despite 10,300 casualties. Once the Allies secured their position in northern France, more troops land in northern France and start making their way east into Germany. The last German counteroffensive is the Battle of the Bulge. The Allied powers beat back the German counteroffensive, and after that, it's all but over for the Germans. In April of 1945, the Soviets reached Berlin from the eastern side, and Hitler commits suicide. On May 8, 1945, victory is declared over Germany, and the day is remembered as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. The last part of the key concept says, the use of atomic bombs hastened the end of the war and sparked debates about the morality of using atomic weapons. Just a few months after starting his unprecedented 4th term, President Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. Through his first 3 terms in office, FDR had 2 different vice presidents. For his 4th term, he took on Harry Truman. Truman was 3 months into his new job at the White House when he became president. After FDR's death, Truman was made aware of the Manhattan Project and the power of this new type of weapon that was developed. Truman foresaw a lot of American casualties in an invasion of the Japanese large islands, since the Japanese had shown they'd fight until the very end. Using the atomic bomb might convince the Japanese that further resistance would be futile and bring the war to an end, though it also meant that a lot of people would be killed in a short amount of time. Truman tries to warn the Japanese that the U.S. had a new kind of weapon, that it was very destructive and therefore they should surrender immediately. The Japanese ignore the threat, so on August 6 and August 9, 1945, the United States bombs the city of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation that was caused is starkly seen in the before and after pictures of both cities. About 250,000 people, mostly civilians, die instantly from the blast, and then millions more suffer from radiation poisoning and cancer. Radiation poisoning would kill all of the living cells inside of people's organs. They would die a very slow and painful death afterwards. Many others who survived the initial bomb would develop cancerous tumors which would make their life difficult and eventually kill them. After the second bomb, on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito surrenders to prevent further death. Victory over Japan is declared, and Douglas MacArthur and the Japanese Emperor sign the terms of surrender aboard the USS Missouri. MacArthur, having been a student of U.S. naval history, had the flag that flew over Commodore Matthew Perry's ship in 1853 when he sailed into Tokyo Harbor to get Japan to open up trade relations with the U.S. fly over the USS Missouri as the surrender was signed. The United States attempted to justify the killing of 250,000 civilians by saying that the death toll would have been a lot higher in the event of a mainland invasion or if the war had continued. Additionally, that death toll would have included Americans and not just Japanese. They also argue that in a total war, such as World War II, civilians made up part of the war effort and so therefore were open to casualties. Finally, they point out that the Japanese had committed atrocities and war crimes of their own. The main example was the Bataan Death March. However, across history, there have only been 2 nuclear weapons that have been used as a measure of war, and they were the ones that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hopefully that will continue to be the case. Finally, here's our recap. Americans view the war in moral terms. Segregation continued in the armed forces. There was new technology that was helpful in fighting the war, but it's also more destructive. And the island hopping campaign in the Pacific and D-Day in Europe were critical to the Allied victory. Finally, the use of atomic weapons in wars were controversial, and only 2 weapons have ever been used. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.